Today our guest is Professor Sarah Ruble from Gustavus, Adolphus. She'll be talking to us about the topic of race and religion in the United States. She's a returnee, so treat her nicely. She'll come back again. We'll try to aim for a little warmer day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. Good to see you all again. I think it's been a couple of years since I've been here, so it is good to be back. Today, I'm going to be talking about what I'm calling turning points in race and religion in the United States. So a little truth in advertising, calling something a turning point, and I'm going to try and not move around too much for our poor camera operator, but that is a little hard for me. So if I start moving too much, just, scream at me. Turning points, basically, for historians means we're going to talk about some things I think are cool. But I picked three because I tend to get chatty, so I tried to limit myself to three. With the aim of sort of figuring out or maybe helping put down some ideas about kind of how we get to the place where we are today, which I think is fair to say we're, in the United States, a place where race is still a vexed issue for us. It's a vexed issue for our country. A little bit of self-promotion here. This is a very non-Minnesotan thing to do, so pardon me. My academic project over the past 2 years has been a little quixotic. Race and religion is actually not my particular field. My dissertation work and my work since then has really been in the history of American missions. But after the events in Charlottesville in 2017, I was kind of between projects and thinking about, well, what do I do next and what makes sense? I have a small child, so I can't just jet off to archives and things like that. And so I decided, partly because I do things like this with some frequency, and there are churches like yours that have robust adult education, but there are a lot of small churches that don't. And I tried to think, is there anything I could do to help in that situation? So I've spent the last 2 years, it's almost ready, creating a YouTube-based adult Sunday school curriculum on the history of Christianity and race in America. It will go, yeah, it's a home project, so it's not a lot of bells and whistles. My wonderful husband has done the video work on it, and I think it's good, but it's not, we didn't spend a lot of money on this. But it has it's supposed to be like an 8-week episode. It's focused very specifically on the history of black-white relations in the United States. There's a lot more to say about race than that, but I thought in 8 weeks, what could I do? And it has a curriculum with it. There's a website. It should go live in the spring. So if this is interesting to you, or you know someone for whom that might be interesting, I can give you some more information on it. But it's a website, sarahruble.com. That too felt weird, like what could I name a website? And I named it after myself, and I feel very odd about it, but there it is. So if you're interested in following up with some of this, it's still not in-depth, but a more in-depth look at some of these issues that will be live in the world, which is also terrifying, because seeing yourself on video is one of the most freaky experiences possible. My husband was doing some editing on it, and I was sitting there going like this. Like, are you going to do this the whole time? Like, yes, that is what I'm going to do. Like, you didn't know you were going to be on video, right? I'm like, yeah, I didn't really process that part of it. Because I wrote the scripts, that was fun, and then I had to say them on video. Okay, that is not what you came here to talk about. So again, I picked 3 turning points from 3 different centuries to try and help us think through where we come from on this topic. And again, I'm going to focus today on black-white relationships in the United States. It's more complicated than that, but I think that at least gives us some very basic vocabulary and a sense of the landscape. So, first turning point, I'm calling it. The year 1667. 1667. We're in the colony of Virginia, one of the key colonies in the 17th century. They passed a law that said that baptism does not free slaves by birth. Baptism does not free slaves by birth. So in this turning point, I want to talk a little bit about this moment in the 17th century, in the 1600s, where we're beginning to see how what we now think of as race begins to operate in the United States, or what becomes the United States, and the role that religion plays in that. I think 1667 is important because we're beginning to see something that still, I think, marks our politics and also our churches, which is in 1667, one way of reading this is they said, in the colonies, or at least in Virginia, your race is going to be more determinative of your social reality than your religion. Your race is going to be more determinative of your social reality than your religion. And I think there's an argument to be made that is still in many ways true in our country, that your race is more determinative of your social reality than your religion, or at least they compete for that role. So, again, case study here is Virginia. Virginia is not the only colony. It's not the only colony with slaves. Of course, there was slavery up and down the coast, but it's a major colony, and it's a place where we can begin to see how some of this plays out. And what we begin to see in Virginia is what I'm going to call the creation, or sometimes academics will use the term construction, of this idea of race. And you may be sitting there and thinking, oh yeah, I'm very comfortable with the idea that race is a construction, or you may be sitting there thinking, I have no idea what you mean right now, so let me explain. When people say that race is a creation or a construction, what they're saying is that naming people as, in our case, black and white, and then giving those terms different social realities doesn't have any relationship to anything that's biologically true. Okay? And for those of you who are like, wait a second, I can see different skin colors. Sure, but hold on. Okay? So a little story. When my younger brother was in preschool, his name is Seth, he came home one day and was talking about another little boy in his preschool class. Let's call him Fred. And Mom kept asking Seth, well, which one is Fred? And Seth kept saying, he's the one with broad shoulders. And Mom kept saying, the one with broad shoulders? Like there's an abnormally broad-shouldered 3-year-old? Yeah. But anyways, to Seth, this was what really stood out about Fred, is that he had very broad shoulders. So the next day, Mom goes to preschool and asks Seth to point out Fred. And Seth points out Fred, and this is in Seattle, which is a very, particularly at that time, racially segregated part of the country for lots of historical reasons. Fred is the only black boy in the class. But to Seth, at that point, black and white weren't the major physical markers that differentiated people. Apparently he differentiated people by those with broad shoulders and those with not. Like that was a physical characteristic he could see that you could separate people by, right? We have chosen to make skin color something that we separate people by. And then even you can push that. If you think about, say, someone whose ancestors are Scandinavian, back to the Vikings, right? And then someone whose ancestors are Italian, back to the Caesars. Do they have the same skin color? Not really. I mean, kind of, maybe, but not really. They don't have the same language. They don't have the same foods, right? They are culturally quite different. But yet at some point we lumped them all into this category and said, and you are all white, right? And then we did the same thing with Africans, right? Who have different skin colors, different languages, different cultures, but and you are all black. That's a construction. Okay? So the question is, how does that come to be, and how does race play a role? I mean, not race, how does religion play a role in it? Well, what we can see in Virginia is that part of the way it comes to be, and this is a longer story going back even to Europe, but I'm going to take it from where it happens in Virginia, is it has a lot to do with money. It has a lot to do with what happens in the early Virginian economy, which is this. People like John Smith came to Virginia in the early part of the 1700s, not as we like to tell ourselves as Americans for religious liberty. That's a nice thing we tell ourselves, but That was true of some folks. It was not true of the people who came to Virginia, by and large. They were quite happy with the Church of England. They came because they wanted to get wealthy, right? And this is one of the ways to do that. And they really came, it looked like, hoping for what happened in a lot of places in Latin America where they would find precious metals. Virginia apparently short on that. They were unhappy to find out. And so they turned to cash crops, specifically tobacco. I don't know a ton about raising tobacco, but what I do know is that it's very labor intensive, right? You have to actually pick the leaves, right? And there's not a lot of machinery right now. So you're gonna have to figure out, if you wanna make money on tobacco, how you get the tobacco, extract it, in ways that don't completely ruin your profit. So you need a labor system. And in Virginia, they tried multiple labor systems. People picked their own tobacco. They had a system of indentured servitude, which basically were people coming from England who would sell their labor for, say, 7 years, and then they could be free. And then there was a system of bringing people from Africa. And that system took a while to really kind of coalesce as being a slave system. It took a while for it to become a system where if your mother was a slave, you were a slave. But eventually that's what happens, okay? But it takes some time. So, a couple key names in this. One of them is the name by Elizabeth Key, who was a woman in the 1650s who was what we call biracial, which they called mulatto, whose father was white and whose mother was black. And complicated legal case, but what ended up happening is that she was apparently an indentured servant as a young child, and then was transferred from one person's property to another. That person died, and she was listed in the will as slave. So she went to court. And she had three major arguments. She said, I was an indentured servant, I'm not a slave. My father is white, and I'm a Christian, so I shouldn't be a slave. My father is white, and I am a Christian, so I shouldn't be a slave. And it took a little while, but she won her case. Over the next 20 years, the House of Burgesses in Virginia passed laws that said two things. Anyone want to guess? Right? Said that slavery is a condition that follows the mother, 1662, and in 1667 says baptism does not free slaves by birth. On two of the three grounds that Elizabeth Key argued, they came back and said no. So now, want to just note some things here. That says something very interesting to me about Christianity. That's true kind of throughout the story, which is there was at least this sense by some people that one of the things baptism should or could mean is that you weren't a slave. I think sometimes we think that's a really, that maybe happened right before the Civil War. That was a long-standing, at least inclination on the part of some people that if I'm a Christian, I can't be a slave. And in fact, it was an inclination on the part of some slaveholders who didn't want their slaves evangelized because they were concerned that either it really would mean, if their slaves converted, that they would no longer be slaves, or their slaves would think that. So part of what happens in 1667 is with the support of the Church of England, Virginia says no. That baptism does not make you free, and that part of what they wanted to do there actually was to encourage slaveholders to evangelize their slaves. Like they were saying, it's going to be okay. Your slaves will stay slaves, and you can evangelize your slaves. But again, one of the things that clearly does is to say, what we say about your race, right, your skin color, is going to be more important than your religious practice. And that may not seem it may seem like a really big deal. The other part of that that's important to know is that for the English, one of the senses that they had coming out of the Reformation was that Protestantism was very much associated with freedom. This was part of a longer kind of anti-Catholic tradition in England, but in England the notion was those Catholics are about not having liberty and not having freedom and being authoritarian, and part of Protestantism is freedom. But not for everybody, as it happens in Virginia. Right? Not for everybody. So we're beginning to see the ways now that religion and race become increasingly intertwined. People who are religious giving credence to this emerging racial system. Again, for a lot of, I think for at least some of the people who in the Church of England got on board with this bill, it was a question that has perplexed Christians, I think, throughout the centuries in various forms, and this one's a racial form, which is the question of how much compromise can Christian faith make with bad social systems before it's no longer Christian faith, right? Again, part of what they were trying to do was to make it possible to convert slaves. And they knew, and they were probably right about this, that if they didn't get on board with this law, they would have no access to slaves. Slave owners were not going to give missionaries access to slaves if missionaries didn't say up front, you will not lose your slaves. I think they were right about that. So this becomes the question. Is there a point where you have so changed the Christian gospel that what you're converting people to is no longer really that Christian? And you can argue that in various ways. Again, it's a perplexing question because I think many slaves who did convert actually sort of got it in the sense of, no, we actually think this means we should be free. You're giving us your version of this. We think there's a better version out there. But again, different Christians have wrestled with this over the centuries. My own tradition, I come out of the Methodist tradition, had the same wrestling in the 18th century. When Methodists came to America originally, when Methodists came to America originally in the 1730s with John Wesley, and it was a complete fiasco. He was a terrible missionary, actually got run out of Georgia. Another story. When non-John Wesley Methodists came to what became the United States in the 1780s and set up, they came and had a very strong anti-slavery stance. They said, you cannot be a slaveholder and a Methodist. And they kept that position for 6 months. In part, for the same reason. They realized that if they said that you could not, they were anti-slavery in that really strong way, they would make no inroads in the South. Right? And so it's that question of how much compromise is too much compromise. So that is Elizabeth Key. That was a long digression from Elizabeth Key. But what happens out of her case, right, in this sense that if we're going to create a labor force that's going to reproduce itself, we are going to have to make rules about that labor force. And we're going to make two, at least, probably more than that, but at least two. One, if you want a labor force that reproduces itself, you take that labor force through the mother, which basically makes slavery a genetic condition. I mean, it doesn't, but that's the import. And then you say that there's no way out even through religion. The other important thing that happens in Virginia, as you may or may not know, is something called Bacon's Rebellion. This is, again, a complex rebellion in the late part of the 1600s, led on both sides by elite Virginians. But one of the things that happens in Bacon's Rebellion is that one of the last group of rebels to surrender was a group of black slaves and white indentured servants. So black slaves and white poor people. And one of the things that became clear out of Bacon's Rebellion to the very small number of elite people at the top is that if the much larger number of white poor people and black slaves saw themselves as a group, they could cause real problems for the elites at the top. That there was a lot more poor white folks and poor black folks than there were elite white folks. And so one of the things they did out of Bacon's rebellion is to try and bring poor white folk onto the side of the elites. And one of the ways that you do that is you say, you have some rights that these black people don't have. The first and most important one is that you will never be a slave. That has nothing to do with your economic condition. That has to do with your race. Okay? So you begin to tell people that their goods in the world are connected not with their economics, but with their racial standing. And then you can also give poor white folks some rights that you don't give black slaves, like the right to bear arms, right? You begin to kind of differentiate. You are not these people, right? You are like us, even though in a lot of ways you're much more like them. And again, I think this is something we continue to struggle with in our country, the ways that race has become for a lot of people a primary marker of identity that when threatened feels like you're threatening their personhood, right? Who they are as a person in really profound ways. And I think for ways that for Christians are just problematic. The notion that for a lot of Christians, threatening race feels almost as bad as threatening Christian identity is telling in a not good way. That we struggle still with that. Okay, I should probably move on. I want to just do two things. So by 1705 in Virginia, this is kind of an interesting moment. They passed a law called the Act Concerning Slaves and Servants. And I want to just look at the language here really quick. Part of the act says that no Negroes, mulattoes, or Indians, although Christians, or Jews, Moors, Mohammedans, or Muslims today as we say, or other infidels shall at any time purchase any Christian servant, nor any other except of their own complexion or such as declared slaves by this act. What's interesting to me is that Christian servant has become sort of the same thing as white, right? These people might be Christians, but they're also these other things. And then you have the people who are just Christians, who are just white. It's a way of sort of saying, if you're not white, you're Christian plus. If you're white, you're just Christian. And this kind of strong identification between Christianity and race. The other one comes from this man, a man named William Byrd, who was an elite white Virginian, who made the really atrocious mistake of keeping a diary. Which, right, then makes you the person that historically we go and we can say bad things about because you were kind enough to write them down for us. So, right, let that be a lesson to you. So, a couple entries from his diary. February 8th, 1709. I rose at 5 o'clock this morning and read a chapter in Hebrew and 200 verses in Homer's Odyssey. I ate milk for breakfast. Their diets are terrible. I said my prayers. Jenny and Eugene, two of the slaves, were whipped. I danced my dance. I read law in the morning and Italian in the afternoon. 2 years later, February 27th, I rose at 6 o'clock, he was sleeping in, and read 2 chapters in Hebrew and some Greek and Lucian. I said my prayers and ate boiled milk for breakfast. This gets better and better. I danced my dance and then went to the brick house to see my people pile the planks, and found them all idle, for which I threatened them soundly, but did not whip them. In the afternoon, Mr. Dunn and I played at billiards, then we took a long walk about the plantation and looked over all my business. In the evening, my wife and little Jenny had a great quarrel in which my wife got the worst, but at last, by the help of the family, Jenny was overcome and soundly whipped. At night, I ate my bread and cheese, I said my prayers, and had good health, good thoughts, and good humor. Thank Almighty God. All right, I'm hearing a lot of tisking. What are you noticing here? Right, I mean, right, this is a man who starts his day with Bible reading and ends it with prayers and whips his slaves in between. and doesn't seem, at least in much of what he writes, to have any kind of cognitive dissonance about this. Now, there are lots of ways to explain this. One is just that William Byrd was a really evil man. You can go that route. But I think probably what's truer is that William Byrd had lived in a society that over time had really convinced him that this was normal and natural and even God ordained. Okay? That this thing, this sense that there are different kinds of people with different roles in the world had become so ingrained to him over time that it just didn't really strike him as a problem. Right? This was blessed by his church, by his whole society. He just really couldn't see it most of the time. There might have been flashes here and there for William Byrd, but most of the time you just can't see this, right? Which always, I mean, one of the questions that always raises for me is, oh my Lord, what in 300 years they're going to look back at us and say, wow, like, how did you just not see this, right? Because you know there's something, right? The thing that we all just now take for granted that in the future they'll think, well, that was obviously evil. Right? But also I think an important lesson about how normalized race becomes, so that people just really don't see it as a construction, as a creation, as something that we've created so we can have this economic system. They just see it as part of the fabric of nature. And that so to overturn it would be really just sort of unthinkable. Right? How could you do that? You don't stop gravity. You don't change thinking about race. It becomes that ingrained over time and naturalized. All right. Any questions about that before I move on? I think the next one. All right. I'm going to jump now because, again, I said turning points were idiosyncratic things I wanted to talk about. So here we go. To 1898 and a coup in Wilmington, North Carolina. I don't know if you were aware of this, but in 1898 there was a coup in Wilmington, North Carolina. That for many years people didn't talk about it, is beginning to get more attention now. What happened in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina was that there was an election. There was an election throughout North Carolina in 1898. And Wilmington was a relatively racially progressive town in the New South, so this is 30 years after the end of the Civil War. There was a pretty significant black middle class in Wilmington, North Carolina. And there were, in Wilmington, they elected a Republican government. A government, so it was all white, an all-white government, but people who were, for the time, relatively racially progressive. That does not mean what it means today, but that means basically we recognize the right of black people to vote, black men to vote. The election statewide in 1898 in North Carolina was incredibly contested. There was a move to throw out any kind of Republican leadership because there was a concern that they were going to continue, as they had been, supporting racial, at least political equality for black people. Overall, the state went to the Democrats, who were opposed to racial equality in 1898, but in Wilmington, Republicans won. So a group of vigilantes led, I've heard, I have never checked this, but a friend who is in a position to know said led by an Episcopal sexton, marched on the town throughout the elected government of Wilmington, North Carolina, installed a democratic government, and in the course of what became a massacre, killed, we think, around 60 African Americans and exiled many prominent African American leaders from Wilmington, North Carolina. And I'd love to say that what happened at that point was that the federal government said, no, you don't overturn an election. We're going to come in here and force you to reinstall the duly elected people, and we will come in and tell you that you have to, we'll put on trial the people who killed these African American members of your community, but that is not what happened in 1898. The Democratic coup stood, and North Carolina, like many southern states, by around 1900 had begun to enact really significant voting restrictions on African Americans, moving them from a position where they had for about 30 years been able to vote to where it became almost impossible for African Americans to vote. Now, I tell you, today this is a turning point for a number of reasons. First of all, I think it's at least useful to note, just in terms of American history, that there had been 20, 30 years in the South where African Americans voted and in some cases held offices up to senators in the United States Congress. That there had been significant African American participation in American political life in the South. But part of what we see here is a process started really in the 1870s to overturn or at least one possible set of results from the Civil War, which was the inclusion of African Americans in political life. And we see that in what is sometimes called the religion of the lost cause in the South. Was also known, and I don't make this word up, this is what they called it, redemption. The redemption of the South. So as you may or may not know, after the Civil War, the federal government went into the South and forced the South into Reconstruction, which included accepting the Civil War amendments, the 14th, the 15th, and the 16th, is that right? 13th, 14th, 15th. I'm not a constitutional scholar. A bunch of really important amendments that ended slavery, gave people the right to vote, and then protected constitutional rights. And that did allow African American participation in political life. The line sometimes from the South was that it was so quote unquote Negro rule. There was no time where African Americans made up the majority of people holding public office. It was certainly not that, but there was active African American participation at all levels of government. In 1877, there was a contested election. There were hanging chads in Florida. No, I wouldn't be surprised if Florida played a role though, because right doesn't it always? But there was a contested election, and a deal was struck where the Northern Republican candidate said, if you give me the election, we'll pull the troops out of the South. Reconstruction will be over. Many people in the North by this time were tired of Reconstruction, and so they said, fine, we're done. And they began to pull Northern troops out of the South, and that began a process of about 20 years of white Southerners pushing African Americans out of political positions. And the religion of the lost cause was part of this. And what the religion of the lost cause says was this. The pre-Civil War South was a godly society. It was a godly society. We were defending the Bible, unlike those northern infidels. Because we took the Bible seriously. Because do you know what the Bible says about slavery? It says, slaves, obey your masters. Do you know what the Bible never says about slavery? Masters for your slaves. It doesn't. It just doesn't. And that is correct, it doesn't say that. And we took that seriously. And people in the North were trying to tie themselves in all these knots, explaining why slavery was wrong, biblically. And they just weren't paying attention to the Bible. We were the biblical defenders. And so, with the war, one way of reading the Civil War would have been that God was punishing us for slavery. That was Abraham Lincoln's reading. Abraham Lincoln thought the whole country was being punished for slavery, but one reading would be the South was. That's not our reading, the South, white South said. The reading is that God punishes those God loves, and the war was purification. The war was to test our mettle. And now what is incumbent upon us is reestablishing a racial order that is as close to the pre-Civil War one as we can. That is what God is calling us to. We need to redeem the South from the imposition of these, again, northern, non-biblical ways, as much as we can without the actual restitution of slavery. So one of the things they began to do was to sanctify Civil War leaders, most famously Robert E. Lee. So here's when Robert E. Lee dies, here's a picture, a Currier and Ives picture of him, and it says underneath him, his deeds belong to history, while his life of devoted, unostentatious piety and firm and living trust in Jesus as his personal Redeemer gives assurance that he has received the Christian crown of glory and entered into that rest that remaineth for the people of God. Okay? This sort of sense that these weren't just military leaders, these were saints that we need to honor. In the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, they also began to erect statues of these Civil War leaders as a way of saying, right, this is their land, right? What these men stood for and did is what we're about. Parenthetically, you might guess that this is part of what the fights are today in the South about these statues, where you have some people saying, well, this is history, right? We're not going to do away with the battlefield of Antietam, right? And other people saying, yeah, but it's not actually Civil War history, right? This is history from the 1890s that was a remade history, right? These are people trying to make a statement. And it's pretty common when you decide that the statement was wrong that you tear down the statue, right? They don't actually have statues of Stalin anymore in the Soviet Union. Part of the reason I know that is because I lived in Seattle for a while, and on my running route, I ran through a place called Fremont, which was full of what my father used to call remnants of the revolution, and I ran past the statue of Lenin that used it, because when no one wanted it, Fremont did. Right, and so this is part of the thing. And so this is this kind of moment in American history where there's this reclaiming of, again, what people are trying to call a holy civilization. The other thing that happens, and I'm looking at my time and realizing I'm talking too much, so I will just kind of speed here for a sec, is that people in the North decided, white people in the North decided, that they were more interested in reconciliation with the white South than they were in continuing to protect the rights of African Americans. It's not that people didn't know what happened in Wilmington. They knew that starting particularly in the 1890s, there was an increase in lynchings of black people, not only in the South, but particularly in the South. They knew that. It wasn't secret. A journalist named Ida B. Wells, a black journalist, wrote a book in the 1890s saying, these are lynchings that are happening, and what's being told to you is that they're happening because black men are raping white women. But if we look at the actual court, look at the documents, that's actually not what is happening in many of these situations. Very infrequently was rape happening at all, but interestingly, it wasn't even being claimed in many of the situations. So people knew, but there was a decision, kind of one of those kind of cultural decisions, that we need to move forward as a country. And if that means moving forward without African Americans having votes in the South, that is the price that, well, they will pay for this kind of rejoined nation. And you can see it even in, again, some major figures. Henry Ward Beecher, brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, who had been an abolitionist, or at least anti-slavery, gets tired of Reconstruction and finally says, the white Southerners, these are good people, and we should join back with them. And that, again, I think is a moment as a country of what was subtly happening is a sense of, well, whose country is it really? When we talk about the good of the country, it was kind of the good of the white country. And a lot of white Christians got on board with that definition. Right? Then when we're talking about the rights of Americans, the good of Americans, we're really talking about the rights and the goods of white Americans. It wasn't all Christians saying that, but it was a number. Okay, one more. So in 1965, something that you will be all more familiar with, the Voting Rights Act. I put this as a turning point because I think today in a lot of our discussions, this is kind of what we fight about. Not the Voting Rights Act itself, although sometimes that, just itself. But also this question. Did the civil rights movement do what it needed to do and basically solve our problems in 1965 with some cleanup needed? Or did what happened in 1965 simply clear the ground so that we could address the much more systemic effects of racism in our country going forward? I think if you get a group of Americans, let's just say it's all white Americans, but if you got any group of Americans together in a room, get 200 people together in a room across all of our divisions, and ask them the question, is racism a problem? They'll all say yes. I mean, you might have a few outliers. Okay? There are always crazy people on the internet. A disproportionate number of people who are crazy hang out on the internet. But if you ask people, is racism wrong? Should black people and white people be able to sit at a lunch counter together? People, conservative and liberal, are gonna say, yeah. If someone is racist, is that a bad thing? Yeah. What we actually, I think, disagree about, now you're kind of getting the gospel according to Sarah, but you invited me to speak, so here you go, right? Is not a conversation about whether racism is a problem. It's a conversation about what it is and how much it affects the very fabric of our society. That there's one version of our racial history that really says, look, between 1955 and 1965, something really important and profound happened, which is that the civil rights movement came in and basically said those civil rights amendments that I can't remember the numbers of are vital and important, and they apply to everybody, and they need to apply to everybody. By 1965, we've done it. And again, you've got to deal with the people who aren't on board, but basically, we've now made the playing field level. And we can move on to other things. And where there's gross racism, sure, we need to deal with it, but basically, the major problem has been solved. And then there are other folks, and Martin Luther King, to be clear, was very much in this camp, who said, no, what this has basically done is taken care of the gross, really easy to take care of injustice. And now we have the much harder things to take care of, which are the ways that race is tied to power and money in this country. And that's much harder to deal with. King actually spent much of the last 3 years of his life trying to deal with that, and was not real popular for it. I think we remember King being really popular. Actually, when he was assassinated in 1968, he was not all that popular. People liked King when he was many people got around King, right, when he was desegregating lunch counters. When King went to Chicago and said, you need to work on housing policy, that did not make people happy. You need to rethink single-family zoning. Not so much with that. So again, it's this question, and I think it's a question not just for Christians, but I think it's one for Christians to take seriously about what this year means. Does it mean basically that we were done? Or is it kind of the year that said, we have now done kind of a lot of the legal work on a big picture kind of constitutional level, but we still now have all of these other questions to go. Another way, a more Christian way to frame that, and then I'll end, is to say part of it's a question, to me, about sin. which is a question, is sin primarily individual? I commit specific sinful acts? Or is sin a system that can actually infiltrate a lot of what we do and make it so even things that we do that are individually good, I'm a parent, I want to send my child to the best possible school, might have socially some systemic problems. Does that make sense? And those are really hard questions. I don't mean to trivialize them or make them sound easy. I think they're incredibly, incredibly difficult. For what it's worth, I went to private school for a number of years because my parents, when I was a first grader, did not want me to be put on a bus for an hour and I think a half to go to a school that had been, the building of which had been condemned in Seattle. I don't know that they were wrong as parents to make that decision. I do know what that meant was that my good was not being joined to the good of a lot of children who couldn't make that choice. They're really complicated questions that we still wrestle with. Thank you.
I know it's hard to generalize where we are as a nation right now, north, south, east, west, all different socioeconomic situations, but to kind of play off your earlier comment, if we were to go 100 years, 200 years in the future, and someone's going to reflect on where we are right now, race, culture, America, Christianity, what would be your take on where we are right now?
That's why I'm a historian, so I don't have to do that. So I think, I mean, and again, I'm a fairly moderate person. Like my gut here is I just want to say, people should be comfortable and things like that. But what I actually think historically is that right now we are living through a moment where this is all really coming home to roost, and that the reason that I think what we're seeing, and again I could be wrong. But I think what we're seeing is that race is very, very, very deeply rooted in American society. And the part that makes me sad is that I think for many Christians, that their racial identity has become so enmeshed with their Christian identity that we're not particularly helpful right now. Not everyone, but for a lot of people, we're not particularly helpful in those conversations because I think that what Christian identity is supposed to give us is the sense of, like, you can't actually hurt me. I mean, you can, right? But like, I'm baptized, I'm safe. So my identity is safe in God. And I think for a lot of American Christians right now, I'm not sure that's true. I think that their identity is safe in their race. And they can't actually pull it enough to even have a conversation where they can be useful. That may be overly judgmental, but I'm a little concerned that that's where we are.
We have time for one more.
All right. Thanks very much.